Science. The supernatural. Biblical prophecy. Global events that threaten to rattle the very foundation of human existence. Critical examination of the most important issues facing today's modern world. Welcome to the Sharpening Report.
You have the Titans of Heaven and the Earthborn Titans. So understand There's two different Titans, right? So they all take their genealogies back to a specific fallen angel, which were the Seraphim order that went to Mount Hermon in the book of Enoch to create the 200 angels. So then, however they survived the flood is where these or at least however the genealogies of these angels surviving the flood, which way you want, if way you want to look at that, are the ones that they take back into prehistory. And so it's very important for their branch, as you were talking about earlier, for distinction and the purity of those bloodlines with those genealogies to grant them that divine right to rule. And the reason why we need to understand that divine right to rule is that these Nephilim kingships that usurped the kingships again in the post-Diluvian epoch, whether it's the Egyptian dynasty or the Hittite dynasty or the Mitanni dynasty or the Amalekite dynasty, and on and on and on and on, and they all used to intermarry. It's important to understand that because they believed that they were not only the political ruler, but also the religious ruler on earth representing that specific God. So that temple that they would be ruling from along with their throne would be dedicated to a specific God or a specific fallen angel that represented where those bloodlines came from.
Hi there, this is James DeWitt of the Sharpening Report, and I am very, very excited to welcome back for a second time with me my very special guest and friend Gary Wayne, author of The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, which I actually happen to have right here, because this is, I'm in, ooh, it's upside down. I'm into this all the time while I'm researching and studying. So, Gary, welcome to the Sharpening Report, and glad to have you back. How have you been?
I have been excellent and busy, but just so happy to be able to come back on the Sharpening Report, my second interview with you, James. And I'm pretty sure some of the things that we're going to be talking about, the audience will probably find quite interesting and will hopefully raise some curiosity to dig into things a little bit deeper on their own.
Absolutely. I haven't thought in advance, or decided rather, what I'm going to title this episode, but basically I've been sharing with Gary that a number of years ago I don't know how many of you maybe have seen, I believe it was in the early 2000s on PBS, they did a special on Tutankhamun where they were looking at his remains, and it was called Reconstructing Tutankhamun or something like that. I'm sure I've got the title wrong, but it was basically to do a computer-generated face for King Tut. What I noticed at that time, I was aware of the Nephilim being giants, but I hadn't thought of other anomalous features that they might have besides being giant. And but I noticed even at that time that there was something unusual about King Tut's head. He was only a 12-year-old boy, if I have it right. But even at 12 years old, deceased, I knew that the process of death and decay does not do something that unnatural to a human head. And PBS deliberately tried to hide the fact. But if you actually go and look at his actual remains, his head pretty much matches what we see today with the elongated skulls that we find in Peru and pretty much all over the world, here in America also, and usually associated with megaliths. So, and then I looked and I remembered, also as a boy, even the stories I read about Akhenaten, that he was also well known for having unusual features, serpentine-like eyes, and sometimes being described as having, quote, a womanly or soft figure with wide hips, very unnatural, with a very long serpentine sort of face, if you've seen the sculptures. This was King Tut's father, his dad, and his mother Nefertiti also shared the elongated skull type of head there. So my point, what I was eager to talk to Gary about, is that I've heard him mention, and this is the primary basis of his book, is that the kingships and rulerships, the thrones of the earth, have for since the beginning of time, as far as I know, have been usurped or affected by the Nephilim or another presence that that the Bible talks about. And so that's why I'm eager to bring Gary into this, who can shed some light on this.
Yeah, well, it's so interesting that you bring up the recreation of Tutankhamun and then referred back to Akhenaten. And I would certainly encourage anybody, just based on what you're saying, to go visit a King Tut museum that's on tour, or just, bring up pictures on the internet. But if you do, have a look at Akhenaten, because he is the father of King Tut. And it's more than just some anomalies. I mean, and just as with Nefertiti, she has this conical, elongated skull as well. And if you look at any of the antiquities, it goes back a long ways. And this is not from binding your head to create that elongated look, because you can't recreate that space, right? It's bigger. That's the big thing, and it's elongated. And so you have this extended protruding chin from Akhenaten, with these very, very high cheekbones, and these thin lips. And you look at that, it is a very much a serpentine look, very much a snake look. And it's no coincidence that the cobra is always all around them, and particularly in the Armana dynasty and their symbolism and their iconology. And typically on the hats, they're going to have the cobra, right? So the snake imagery is just so very important, just as Osiris was a serpent god. Just as you have the feathered serpent with Quetzalcoatl, or just as you have the seraphim angels that are talked about in Isaiah 6, which are an order of fiery serpent angels. And just as you go back to, I think it's Numbers 21, where Moses is is going to, through the help of God, protect the Israelites from the venomous snakes, right? And so where I'm going with this is that the word Nakash is the general serpent word that's used for a serpent, whether it's in Eden or in this Numbers account, except for one time in that Numbers account where Moses puts this image of the serpent on the end of the pole, and then the word seraphim, or seraphim, is the word that is used there instead of Nakash, which was going to protect them and heal the Israelites from the venomous Nakash, or serpents. And what's important about that is what that's telling us is that the seraphim angels had the face of a snake, right?
Yeah.
And with wings, it becomes a dragon. And all of a sudden, you understand all of this imagery of serpents and dragons in prehistory, whether it's with the kings or it's with the gods, because the Nephilim, who are produced from the fallen angels and are sons of gods in other cultures, as they're called, whether it's from Zeus or Poseidon or whomever, who are copulating to create the Titans, as they would be called in the Greek culture, the Anunnaki in the Sumerian culture. They also had the face of a snake. And what was also very scary about these individuals is their eyes glowed. So just as the seraphim angels were in their spirit form, they are translucent, shining beings. So were the original Nephilim, and for many generations after, as we read through some of the accounts of prehistory. And that's why they're called the Shining Ones, whether or not it comes from the Tuatha De Danann tradition or the Anunnaki tradition or the Creek tradition. These were shining monsters. And,
Yes.
they just weren't tall. These were monsters. Even with Og, if you use the size of his bed, the traditional length is about 14 feet length. But he was a king, so they would use the royal cubit, which would have put his bed closer to 15 to 16 feet. And so he would have been closer to 15 feet. And it was made of wood, not made of wood because it would have crushed the wood. So it had to be made of iron so that his weight wouldn't crush it. And the reason why that is that whereas the average human is got a 3-to-1 height to width ratio, the Nephilim had a 2-to-1. So they're extremely broad and muscular.
Yeah.
And they also had, as in the definition of Anakim, as they show up in the Old Testament after the flood, long-necked. That's the definition as you take that back to Hebrew.
Yes.
So they had that long serpentine neck to match. So these were frightening individuals that were the demigods or the kings of the thrones that started great dynasties. So, I've just thrown out a whole bunch of little things there that you may want to dig into a little bit further before we move on.
And initially, as a younger guy, I very easily got the concept that there were giants on Earth, and they weren't of human origins. I didn't contemplate exactly how they got here until I got much older. I don't know how. I just we all kind of, so many times I hear again and again, I don't know how I missed this. But, it's very apparent that, of course, Satan might want to just outright eliminate mankind through violence and warfare. But I'm sure he's a pretty smart being. He's got secondary and third sort of tier ideas about things. Well, if that doesn't work out, this is what I'm really going to be doing anyway. And so, we have the whole copulation with human women producing throughout time, obviously, many various types of, by the time they get into the promised land, just like you mentioned, the long-necked tribe, I started getting the idea that perhaps there was a variety of different, I'm thinking he had an arsenal of different tribes with probably different specialties, almost, if that makes any sense. That would make sense from a strategic point of view. And I'm thinking, there's just a big strategy that we really don't pick up on just in glossing through the text in the long-term sense on the enemy side. So strategically, I hadn't really, at some point I started to really get the idea that it's no joke that, I am not one of these David Icke people. I don't think that everybody in a leadership role is a lizard person, but I do take very seriously the idea that anytime someone new shows up in a powerful political position, I'm very scrutinizing and watching everything because I believe
Yep.
they've always been here and they still are here, and their primary goal is to steer Earth into a particular direction.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And just so that the audience tonight is clear with what we're talking about, is that a lot of people believe that leaders and the royal families have a changeling quality where they can change their form and underneath are lizard type people. Maybe that's the case. Maybe they inherited this changeling quality from the original fallen angels who did have that changeling quality. But it's possible, but I think they're just more the descendants of the giants. And over time, as there was some dilution of the bloodlines to keep disease out, they took more and more on of human traits. But that doesn't mean they don't trace and specifically keep their genealogies as a justification for their divine right to rule, even to this day. And if people are historians of the more modern era, I mean, the Stuart family and King James, he's very famous for his position on his divine right to rule. That comes from their heritage. That goes right back into prehistory.
And some of their language becomes very esoteric. They're saying these things, they're declaring it, and we hear it and it goes right over our heads. We don't quite get what they're saying in their narrative.
Well, and they know that they, in the language that they speak, unless you're part of the bloodlines or unless you're part of the secret societies or the mystical religions and have been initiated into their language and their allegories and their codes, they know for the most part they can speak and do things right in front of us, right in front of our noses, and people will not notice. And they count on that. They mock us by doing that, and they laugh at us because they believe they are superior to us, that the average human is a mundane and obsolete being, not worthy to be reincarnated, as in their belief system, or resurrected, which are two different concepts, which we have in our belief system. But they're like cattle, and we were to be treated like cattle. So therefore,
oh no, I think we have a freeze up right when you're getting to the best part. Okay, if we could back it up a little bit, we lost the audio for you for a second.
yes, okay, so I'll try and pick it up and try and make some sense of it here. Okay, so even though that they have that ideology of a superior complex towards us as mundane humans and cattle, as they like to call us, do not underestimate the legitimacy of what they believe.
Absolutely.
Whether or not they actually have the genealogies that go back into prehistory or not, it's certainly what they believe. And connecting that back to what you were just saying, James, about the people that are either presidents or in government, they control those secret societies that produce the politicians that carry out their agenda. And yes, they want to bring about a specific agenda, which goes right back into prehistory and is so key to the rebellion of the fallen angels, that they want to bring about the end time.
Absolutely.
They want to bring it out as fast as they can And at any time other than the ordained time, if they can, but they will accept the ordained time if they have to, and of course they will. But they are always trying to bring about this rendezvous with destiny. They want this showdown that is prophesied. They believe they can win. And of course we know how it ends from the Bible, but that's completely different than the brainwashing through the initiations and what they get, because they've been told that their God, who they call Lucifer, and the great architect of the universe, and several other names that go back into prehistory, it's all the same God, or fallen angel, is the equal of our God. And it's that dualism that is in the religion, right? Good versus evil. And they're in balance, yin and yang, as it comes out in Taoism, or Eastern mysticism. And that's why they believe they can actually win the rebellion and have a realm separate from the God of the Bible, whom they call an evil God. Not that we believe that, that's what they believe. And that they can live free and away from the oppressive God of the Bible. That's what they're after. And they want to create themselves as being gods in the physical universe, as opposed to what God is offering us to be resurrected into heaven and into the spirit realm to live forever. So they're trying to recreate what they had in the first generation of the Nephilim, who had the immortal spirit from the fallen angels. And so
is that what we hear when I hear the term golden age? Is that sort of the time period we're talking about?
The golden age, as they call it, or Zep-Tepi, as it's called in Egypt, or the first time. And what they call the age going forward that they want to recreate, they have this idea of this utopian 1,000-year reign, which is again a copy of the millennium that's prophesied, as all things are, just as Antichrist is a copy of the true Christ, right?
Yeah.
And they try and emulate everything in that sort of manner. So they call that the New Age, or the New Age of Aquarius, or specifically, as what Francis Bacon wrote about, who's intermixed in this whole sort of affair and one of the ringleaders of secret societies coming into the modern era. He wrote a book called The New Atlantis.
Yeah.
And this is the end time. This is their dystopia that they want to put on us, because in this world, it only has room for people who have either the bloodlines or the DNA marker or the gene, as they like to call it, in some accounts, that go back to the fallen angels. And that's why when you have this Rosicrucian, which of course Bacon was Rosicrucian as well, the Georgic Guidestones that most people believe were put up by the Rosicrucians, it's this idea of a population of only 500 million people. That means all the mundane cattle will be slaughtered off.
Yeah. And the the very notion, well, I mean, if there are people out there who's kind of like, well, maybe. These people saying that they're of bloodlines and kingships in their history and things like that. I'll tell you what, there's nobody more scrutinizing than these societies themselves. Certainly they're not just going to let anybody claim this unless there's something to back it up. And they're very serious about it. That's why they are the elite.
Yeah. And I also believe that's also the reason why they're also creating all of these banks of blood banks and DNA banks and genealogy banks, so that when they're ready for the end time, it's easier to select who they want to get rid of, right? And when we look at how they trace some of their genealogies back, to give you some sense of veracity to what we're talking about, let's say Prince Charles, for example, is on record for saying that his genealogy goes back to Vlad the Impaler, right? And they have genealogies to prove that. And what's important to understand about that is Vlad the Impaler was initiated into the Sarkani Rond, or the Ordo Draconis, in the early 1400s, just as his father was, to put the dragon kingships back on the throne and to pursue the pursuits of thought. And Vlad was initiated in the mystery school of Solomon in Austria, and he is the character that the dragon vampire Dracula means dragon, and the A on the end of Dracula means son of a dragon, so he was son of Vlad II, is based on. That's because he's a dragon king that goes back to these dragon seraphim angels that we're talking about. And the allegory that's been created around it is this good versus evil that we talked about, Christianity against this bloodline. It shows it inverted today, but that's the allegory that they have created so that, you know, we don't catch on. They'll turn that back around, that we're the evil people trying to destroy them, as opposed to they're going to be destroying us. And you have, completing it, the allegory, you have the teeth of a cobra that we talked about with the Egyptian dynasty iconology, with the fangs that they drink the blood on. And the reason why blood drinking is important is because in the time of the Nephilim, after they lost their immortality, they were drinking blood of humans and animals and others, you know, whatever source they could get for blood, to try and keep their immortality in place and to help with their cognitive ability. So you have all of these allegories working in this Dracula sort of thing. And again, Vlad the Impaler, I mean, they take their genealogies back to the Scythians and the giants of the Titans, and specifically the Sarmatians, who are known as the dragon people, who come from, you know, some specific Titan angels, right? Because in the Greek mythology, you have the Titans of heaven and the earthborn Titans. So understand there's two different Titans, right? So they all take their genealogies back to a specific fallen angel, which were these seraphim order that went to Mount Hermon in the book of Enoch to create the 200 angels. So then, however they survived the flood is where these, or at least however the genealogies of these angels surviving the flood, which way you want, if way you want to look at that, are the ones that they take back into prehistory. And so it's very important for their branch, as you were talking about earlier, for distinction and the purity of those bloodlines with those genealogies to grant them that divine right to rule. And the reason why we need to understand that divine right to rule is that these Nephilim kingships that usurped the kingships again in the post-Diluvian epoch, whether it's the Egyptian dynasty or the Hittite dynasty or the Mitanni dynasty or the Amalekite dynasty, and on and on and on and on, and they all used to intermarry. It's important to understand that because they believed that they were not only the political ruler, but also the religious ruler on earth, representing that specific God. So that that temple that they would be ruling from, along with their throne, would be dedicated to a specific God or a specific fallen angel that represented where those bloodlines came from.
That's absolutely fascinating. So going back to the earliest times, say directly after or following the Tower of Babel and its fall, did you find what were the particular sources from that period on that you found fascinating or helpful in your research?
Well, what I found absolutely stunning was the whole and shocking was the whole idea that the secret societies and all the other religions kind of link themselves back to Babel as well. And so they'll give a history of how Hinduism branched out from Babel and how all of these religions advance around the world, just as the dynasties start to move out from there. But you also have to understand that there's the branches of the giants that are there too, right? That also start dynasties, and descendants of Noah intermingle with the giants to create other kingdoms. Like in the lineage of Canaan, you've got all of these peoples like the Amorites and the Hittites and the Hivites and all these other peoples that are basically hybrids that are marrying into the Rephaim and the Anakim and the Zamzuzim and the Abim and all of these other branches, even though they're pretty much all considered Rephaim as they branch out after that, back to the Nephilim.
I'm so glad you pointed on that. sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. I'm
No,
so glad you
go
you
ahead.
brought this up because I don't want to overlook it myself because we tend to kind of phase it out because they weren't listed in the League of Nations and all this stuff. But uh, you know, I find it even looking here in America in this in the Americas in the continent here that we're on, that I'm finding that yeah they had a whole system set up. They had a mining operation going across the entire country, and I mean it's all over the world. So I just wanted
Yeah,
to interject that.
there's branches that are all over the world. So you have a separate sort of dragon bloodline that develops through China, like they like to take their branches back there. So there are different branches. And the other thing to remember is what happens at Babel is that, and again, understand, maybe I should make my point clearer on it, is
Yes.
that like the Freemasons, for example, they take their history back to Babel and back to the time of Enoch, son of Cain, and the progeny and the development of the seven sacred sciences as the creation for the sun-worshipping, bull-worshipping religion that gets passed on to the post-Diluvian epoch, and the start of the secret societies. So Tubal-Cain, Enoch, son of Cain, Lamech, of the Cain line, are all major patriarchs in their belief system, as it is in Gnosticism, which is their religion. And
Absolutely.
so Nimrod is the first grand master of Freemasonry after the flood. And he writes the first constitution for the Masonic Society that gets carried forward and isn't reformed until Tutmosis III reforms it in Heliopolis. And so he's a very, very important figure to the Freemasons because he marries up with Hermes, who finds the discovery of the knowledge of the seven sacred sciences that were hidden, or the location, and some of the information were inscribed on two pillars, which are those two famous pillars, Boaz and Joachim, in the Masonic temple. That's actually what it represents, not the superficial allegory people understand it as. And so he partners with Nimrod, and they start to develop this information. And so the first development of that technology is the city and the ziggurat that's going to reach up into the sky. And we get a hint of that in the Bible because God says something to the effect, paraphrasing it, that speaking as one language and as one people, there's nothing that they will not be able to do. This is a reflection
Yes.
of that knowledge being created. And perhaps the knowledge that turns Nimrod into a Gibberon, as opposed to Nephilim. Distinction there. So he starts to become like a Nephilim, and as King James says, began to be a mighty one, as opposed to born, because we know he's the son of Cush, not the son of
Right.
angels. So he's not Nephilim pure. And so after Babel, with the dispersion, you have Nimrod moving to Mesopotamia, and where the Akkadians come from, and then the Babylonians and the Assyrians and all those other people descending down through him. And you have Hermes, who partnered with Nimrod, moving to Egypt with Mizraim and Put, and establishing the new Egyptian religion and kingdom. So those are the main two ones, plus these other Nephilim kingships that are setting up also in the Middle East, whether it's in Sodom and Gomorrah, which is a very important city to the Gnostics as a city of light, and a replanting of these Nephilim after the flood. And that's why they look at, again, God as being evil for destroying their city of light, which is why you get Camelot in the King Arthur allegory as a city of light, a shining city, with Lot being sort of the connection back to Sodom and Gomorrah, and Cam coming out in its root as to curbed light. So they've got their allegories going all over the place. So from Egypt and Mesopotamia, from Mesopotamia you have the religion being spread into India and then into China, and then from Egypt that spreads basically to Greece, Rome, up and down the Canaan strip, and the religion starts to export around the world. So understand that these kingships and these religions have been in partnership from the beginning, and then very shortly thereafter from the flood again, all with the same agenda.
Yeah. And the validity of those things, that's why I'm so hardline on displaying these things and looking at them, because that really brings us to today, and being aware of this agenda. Then you start to notice certain things, and even as you were saying earlier, in some of the flowery speeches you might hear being given publicly on CNN or whatever, sometimes you just hear these things that just sound poetic, but it seems to have no place in actual what we're supposed to be talking about
Yeah,
here. And then you start to,
like 1,000 points of light.
yeah, then you start to pick up on this message that echoes all the way back through the corridor of the ages. And it's saying the same message, and that is not by coincidence. Absolutely not.
No, it's not. And they want this new age. They want the global order. They want the new Atlantis. They want the age of Aquarius because for a number of reasons. The first part of the allegory is Atlantis, where Atlantis had not just this island continent, but as Plato recounts in Critias and Timaeus, that was actually a empire that was made up of 10 kings. So when Poseidon
Yes.
marries Clymene and produces 5 sets of Titan twins, these are the 10 kings that are going to rule over the Atlantean Empire. And what they're trying to do is conquer the world with their force, with their armies. And they don't quite get there because they're, as Plato says, they're defeated by Hercules and Theseus fighting against them for Zeus, and known as the antediluvian Greece at that time. But what's important to understand is they were known as the helm of world government. And that was the golden age that we had talked about earlier. So that's the new Atlantis that they want to set up in the end time. And then a connection to that is that you have 10 empires recorded as part of the world government in both Daniel and Revelation. And then what's interesting about that is you have a very high up organization created in the late 60s called the Club of Rome. And this has essentially high level of purebloods with some other people in it, but they report directly to the Rosicrucians. And what they were set up to do was to set up world government, but in 10 blocks of nations, or 10 trading blocks, or 10 spheres of influence. And they've been working at that ever since. And that's why you see the EEC or the NAFTA agreements. You have all of these types of agreements to create free trade, but from as an influencing part, whether it ends up being Canada, US, and Mexico, or it gets reformed into Canada, US, and Great Britain, who knows? But they've got 10 of these that they want to see it end up with. And from there, they'll send their representatives or kings to the world government. And that will be what that looks like. But it also has to have that universal religion, right? That Babylon religion, the Babel religion. And it has to be this polytheist religion that was started by Enoch the Evil. And they need world government and this universal religion for a significant reason. Not only are they wanting to have a rebellion against God, but they want to also evolve into gods. And so if you listen to Theosophy or Gnosticism or New Age, because they're all the same religion, that when you have the world united, they'll have a harmonic convergence, where they'll vibrate into a higher level of being or into godhood. And what they're trying to do is unite what they call the spark of the divine, or the gene of Isis, or the bloodlines, or whatever you want to call it, or as the Bushes called it, 1,000 points of light, is why they need the New World Order to unite those 1,000 points of light so that they can move into a higher level of being.
Yeah. And it's very interesting that you mentioned that also. I want to throw this in there, and this may startle maybe a couple of people out there, but I research a lot of things, and I listen to a lot of people sometimes who talk about UFO abduction. And in so many of these experiences, these are people who, in many cases, have no interest in anything like religion or history or things like that, to know sort of like what we're talking about here. But the message that these people are given time and time again, I hear these people say, I have been told, that I'm to deliver a message to earth, that we can make this a better place if we will all raise our consciousness to a higher vibrational level. I mean, basically quoting
Yes.
what you're saying here. So
Yep.
there's a very
Yeah.
real element to change the atmosphere here for a reason. Trying to
Well,
what
exactly.
do you think?
And you are absolutely 100% on. And they're also trying to provide us more knowledge and information, right? And that, we need to join this galactic table of species. Why? Because there's good and bad aliens, right? So we're going to have to fight for our rebellion when we're ready, which is the end time, against the God of the universe and his angels. That's what they're setting us up for. But when you look at science fiction, that basically is preparing people for all of these concepts.
Yeah.
What's the religion that you see in it? You see this mystical religion, this, as in Star Wars, the good force and the bad force, right? And you have the Zen-like masters of the Jedi, right? And all of that is an allegory, and that's why you have so much allegory of ancient history, whether it's Luke Skywalker or Anakin, of names that are encoded in Star Wars, because
Absolutely.
they're preparing us for what's coming, and it's by design. But it doesn't matter however you stretch that out. It doesn't matter whether it's Star Trek or any science fiction or Babylon 5, which was a great allegorical name, right?
Yeah, it really was.
They all have the same mystical religion, this dualist religion of forces of good versus evil that are always in balance and trying to oppose each other. It's a constant, and that's not coincidence.
Yeah, and it's all reconditioning us to give a very particular view of the mechanics of the universe, if you will, that's
Yep.
completely false.
Yeah. Yeah, to give us an idea that, you can't believe in this obsolete view of the Bible because it doesn't reflect what all of this other information or false doctrines that we're providing you as to what's going on in the universe. And again, I look at the ancient alien mythos that's out there that the History Channel does, and so many other shows and writers that are out there. It's telling the same story as what is told in the Bible, except that they change God and the fallen angels into just a technologically advanced level of aliens, and then skirt the issue of where they, how were they created, but they're not really concerned with that. So they're telling us that story and preparing us for it in another format. And we need to understand that this whole ideology is dead serious to prepare us for this deception, even though the aliens may have a little bit larger makeup than what most people might think. And again, if we take a lead from what they're telling us in all of this propaganda, is you have like the little gray aliens, and you have the lizard aliens, and you have maybe some furry ones, and then you also have some very powerful ones, right?
Yeah.
And I think you've got what they believed is coming out of prehistory is the survival of some of these beings that were created in the greater Nephilim creation concept. So not only were the Nephilim reprobate beings and beings created against the laws of creation, other beings were created, like little ones like gnomes and fairies and things like that. And if you get into the fairy mythology, you have the gray fairy that has flying machines, kidnaps people, does DNA testing, things like that for reproduction, and then returns people without a memory that go back into the mists of time. And if you didn't know, and I put it in my book, if you didn't know it was a fairy abduction, you would think it was a great alien abduction. And if you look into things like Lord of the Rings, they show you these little people, whether or not it's hobbits or it's the dwarves, and these are the ones that live in the earth and the mountains, and they do smithcraft and things like that. That is right out of that mythology. And then you have the elves, which are the more elegant ones, the more royal ones. And then there's two types of elves. They only show the one type of elf in there, but there's a good elf and and a bad elf or a white elf and a dark elf. But it's part of that whole mythology. And at the end of the Lord of the Rings, you have these beings on a boat sailing away, which represents the flood, because now it's the age of man, right?
Yes.
So you don't see them around, but they believe they survive somehow, some way. Whether or not we believe it or not, it's part of this alien deception. And somehow they've either recreated them or they did survive. But and I think you have demons, I think you have fallen angels, and I think you have a number of these other beings that have developed great technology in the antediluvian age to a level that would be greater than ours, because we haven't peaked yet and the end time isn't here. And just as Jesus said, his second coming will be like the days of Noah, and I think in all aspects.
Yeah.
And if we look at the technology that seems to be there in prehistory of creating these great megaliths that are unaccounted for, whether they're pyramids or Machu Picchu or so many other locations around the world, and we look at some of these creatures that were created, whether or not it's centaurs or it's chimera or it's the elephant-headed beings in India, or and on and on and on, Pegasus that are in these mythologies, I think they have the ability to either do DNA manipulation or crossbreed in ways which are absolutely an abomination. And that perhaps, at least from their belief system, that these people have survived somehow, some way.
Yeah. And I found a particular with Egypt. I found you will see. I mean, like, some things are right under our noses. Uh, we see depictions of servant type people in front of people who seem to have authority and things like. And they might be represented in different scale.
Yeah.
And in grade school, I was fascinated by this stuff, but I just thought, well, that's just a depiction of their level of authority. The bigger the person is, no, because one of these, and this was proof in my mind, concrete proof. Recently, I have pictures. I don't know if you saw it. It was a particular s- glyph drawing that someone was restoring, doing a little work on, and it depicted a giant. I would guesstimate in the picture they were maybe 16 feet tall at the largest, maybe 11 feet at the smallest, but they had an elongated head. I always looked for the missing link between the giants, who we knew their source, and these elongated skulls. And this particular being was a giant and had the head, but they're often depicted in Egypt. If you look at some of the hieroglyphs, as the builders, as the crafters, the smaller human-sized normal people are actually bringing them supplies, bringing them tools, serving them while they do some of the sculpting and work. And I think this might have been in old Egypt.
First time Egypt. Yeah.
Yes.
And to a certain degree, I think a little bit after the flood as well. So let me connect a couple of those dots for you. So in Egyptology, and understand there's different civilizations in Egypt, right? So you get some different names on things, just as with some of the other cultures. But you have in prehistory basically a constant of 7 gods, whether it's the 7 major Olympus gods or the 7 gods of Asgard, or there's a constant of these watchers. And again, even in Norse mythology, there might be as many as 9 civilizations. In the other ones, it's as little as 4 or perhaps 7, just as they have 7 sacred mountains around the earth. So there's a constant from these gods. And we talked about the Nephilim as being the king and at the head of the temple, and the messenger and the mediator from the gods on earth as part of their divine right to rule and to carry out the gods' orders. But you also have, coming out of these 7 watchers, as an Enoch, I mean, some of those angels would be, Azazel would be one of them, right? Or Gadriel, or Adriel, or Temiel. So you have 7 there as well. Then you have Satan as the 8th, and all of them have that other creator god that's above them as well. But in Egypt, they created the Semsu Hor, or the companions of Horus, or the followers of Horus, right? So, and in other civilizations, you might see them as the Nagas in India, or the Nakals as in the Kishamaya account, or you would have the Oannes as being one of these gods that was setting them up, of the Sabeti in Sumeria. This is the snake order of priests that is being set up. And through here, these are the builder gods, which they're also named to connect what you're talking about. And they're creating these giants and this priesthood, which would also be symbolized in polytheist literature and history as wizards, right? If you see a wizard, that's a magi or a magician. So understand the allegory, but really like the priest of Egypt in this case, right? And so wizards are connected back, like Merlin, to Atlantean mythology. That's where the wizards were. They were the great black magic. But that's really the religion that they're talking about. And so you have these snake orders of priests that are working with the Nephilim kings and the gods to build these great megaliths and monuments to honor the pantheon of gods, right? It's part of the worship. That's the first thing that they want to do. And it's the fifth science of their teaching, which is geometry, but in the craft, they call it, and the craft is the secret societies, Freemasonry in particular, Masonry, that is called Masonry as the fifth science. And that's why the Tower of Babel is so important to them, right? And all these other
Absolutely.
Egyptian megaliths, because it's part of worshiping their god, which is the great architect of the universe, right? Just as Pharaoh means from its hieroglyph great house, or a house or a column, right? So everything in building is connected to these builder gods, or the senior ones.
Right.
And even in the Asgards, they were called builder gods. And when that ancient society was coming to an end through the flood, and in other accounts through a conflagration of events, including the flood, so you have volcanoes and meteorites and other things that are going on, but essentially the same story. They have what they call the seven sages that are surviving the flood to start teaching these religions again after the flood, right? And these become the new companions of Horus, or the new followers of Oannes, or Oannes, or the Sabeti, or the mystery schools of Greece, and or literally the Babel story is how that flows through. But they get this knowledge that is important, that they're reteaching the survivors of the flood to start building again and to honor the gods. So just connecting those orders and the building aspect to, it's all part of their legacy, their history, and their religion. Yeah.
It's always a pleasure,
Okay,
Gary.
well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Hopefully we've given the audience something to think about and consider, and love to do another show again when you get a chance, James.
Absolutely, and please, viewer, don't go away. Hang in there, because after the credits here, I've got something special for you to show you a little bit about what Gary is talking about, and some of the things visually, what he's covered in his book, and what we've been talking about here. So thank you, Gary Wayne, for joining us, and I want to thank you for joining us on the Sharpening Report.